Our world is lost in unnecessary fear and hurt. Our systems seem scientifically engineered to make you small, powerless, and always waiting for the next great leader who will fix the problems around us. Worse, we're witnessing neighbor versus neighbor while warfare breaks out around our family tables. But you have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka. Jim, you're really close to ground zero on this issue, and I mean physically close, in harm's way kind of ground zero. I'm talking about the train derailment that happened last week, and it's getting some play. But let's take this episode and really dig into that just a little bit. And I'm new on this. I've watched the headlines. I know something about the geography. We've preliminarily discussed it just a few seconds ago. But what's this like, man? You're right there. What is it like being in it?
Well, I would like to dial back a tiny bit. I am in Ohio. I'm about 90 minutes drive away. So I'm pretty much outside the zone. I don't really feel any personal threat. And I don't have anybody that I personally know at the moment that I'm aware of who feels personal threat. Like nobody in my immediate circle of family or friends who has contacted me and said, I'm here in the zone. Now, Downsize DC that I've run for a lot of years has followers, and I'm sure that I know that there are people that follow us that are in that area. So I know that there's people who probably will even hear this show. They'll say, well, no, Jim, you know somebody. I imagine somebody's going to raise their hand after I say that. But to do the geography here, I am west northwest. And when I say that, it's almost completely west. It's just a couple of degrees north on the same line of where this is at. The location of this event is really the Appalachian type area of our country. It is the borderline between Pennsylvania and Ohio, the East Palestine, which by the way is how it's pronounced. I've been in Ohio my whole life, and I'd even seen it on the map and did not know that that's how that was pronounced. I would have said Palestine, but it's East Palestine. And it is right there on the border, right near the Ohio River. And so this news does not merely affect this region of the country. It affects people who are downstream on the Ohio River, and will continue and may even affect people we don't know yet on the Mississippi, because the Ohio runs into the Mississippi and goes downstream from there. So I'm outside the zone. I don't feel any particular threat or concern for my own personal family's well-being, my pets, or anything at the moment. But interestingly, it's only about 20 minutes from when we first came back to Ohio, we were looking at moving. So I am a little familiar with the area.
Are you being like closer to it than I am in California? Are you getting any news that is not being reported by the majors right now? And just sort of like bring us up to date, because I'm a newbie on this.
So I want to say, it's funny you bring this up, because it gives me an opportunity to say something that's been on my heart this morning, actually. And I didn't have it in notes here, but to talk about. But I don't believe that the regime media, the large media organizations, have any special ability to do reporting. And I do not believe a lot of what they do actually amounts to journalism. I believe it's a form of entertainment, and they are incredibly risk averse, and they're not connected. So one of the problems in this particular story is that this happened on February 3rd. That's 2 weeks ago. And it took about 10 days for it to start to become a national story. It doesn't mean that the New York Times didn't put something up over the weekend after it happened, that the news wasn't initially reported, but then it was quickly forgotten about, even though what has been happening and transpiring there is incredibly newsworthy. And there's been some people wondering, like, why aren't environmentalists all upset about this? And why is the national media running around the clock coverage? Because this is actually a really major story in the making. And I have two thoughts about that. And the first is that nobody's from there. This is a place where some people are raised, but if you're raised there, you leave. It's an area that tends to be a forgotten area. And so the people who make up the intelligentsia, the people who are in the right salons, the members of our national news media, aren't from there and know no one from there. So there is that aspect of this. And then this is what's been on my heart. The people who have been covering this story, the people who've given us the best information about what's happening there, are smaller independent media news branches. So news is moving towards a subscription model. And to some degree, I might even want to take this show in that direction at some point. But when someone does a program that gives you information that you value, if freedom is what you really want, and if you want people to find out the truth and to do the right thing, then what you should be doing is you should be supporting those organizations. The word amateur, and you'll hear me say this many times, has at its root word the same word as love. It's amore, right? And the amateur is the true lover of in the case of journalism, of the news. The amateur journalist is the lover of the news. And they're not worried about liability. They're not consulting with lawyers. They're not concerned that they're going to lose their advertising dollars. They are out there pursuing the truth in a unique way. And they are actually more credible and useful. And this is increasingly proven true, that crowdsourcing the news and having lots of programs on platforms like YouTube and Pandora and Spotify and so forth has real value and should receive your support if you want to break the stranglehold of the regime media, who is just now picking up the story. And one more thing on this. They're picking up the story because it bubbled up from the bottom. They're not picking up because they knew the right thing. They're not actually the source of news. They're monitoring other sources of news so you can go right to the root. If you find programs, listen to them faithfully, and then support them financially. So I would encourage people to check us out. Here's my chance to get in a plug. Our sponsor is the Zero Aggression Project. Go to zeroaggressionproject.org, sign up for a subscription, and follow what it is that we're doing here, and find a platform. We're on several of them. Find a platform and make sure that you're not missing future episodes, but also find the people that you trust to bring you the news.
That's it. That's the thing. Because when the national news doesn't carry it, we in California don't see it. However, I'm very familiar with the small independent situation, a paper that I love and follow, which tracks like the events in a tiny community of 3,000 people, is one of those papers that is just in danger of disappearing these days. And we've lost so many of them that it's hard to know, what's going on. And that means that the news we get nationally is like news light, and it's what they want us to read rather than
one of the sources that I used to come here today was one episode of a TikTok performance that was just packed full of information, right? So the news is coming from a variety of sources today. Independent journalists are moving faster. They're doing more video than writing. You should find people that you trust. I want to put a high premium on this. This is like almost a mission for me personally, to get people off the conflict machine and onto sources where they're actually going to be able to get some sense of the truth. Although I will tell you that the independents in this case, I think, have also fallen into some of those same conflict machine traps. And maybe some of those will come up in the course of our discussion of this story.
Yeah, well, it's hard, because conflict sells. And if you're going to be all news all the time. So let's qualify this right away by saying that, neither you nor me are a reporter, although you've had an opportunity to get closer to the facts on this than I have, through proximity and interest and all of that. Can we just quickly review like what actually happened back on the 3rd of February?
Yeah, before I do that, let me throw in one more thing. I'd kind of like to, if I could, cover an epistemology of news.
This is important.
Okay,
people.
So the story's breaking right now. So what's going to happen? I want everybody to be clear. I'm going to say some things that are the best knowledge that I have right now. I'm no expert. I've just been recently following this story. I'm, maybe just one step ahead of some of the people watching right now. So, and by the time I'm going to exhaust most of my knowledge, I suspect, right in front of you. But there's a constant in stories like this, and that is that the initial facts end up being wrong. Initial fears and worries and concerns end up being exaggerated. Those are the things that tend to happen. And so it is almost inevitable that I'm going to say something that is going to be proven inaccurate. I may even go on and on and on about a particular thing that in this particular case turns out not to apply. And what I generally would prefer people do, although it's not really humanly possible, is that they wait until all the facts are come in before they assess the story. If you stick with a story that's a year or two old, the reason that doesn't happen is that we know that the stuff that's happening in the headlines right now, the way the media is setting the agenda, it's called agenda setting theory, quite literally, means that we have to discuss the issue as it's live and happening right now. And that's part of the reason we're even doing this episode at the moment. But the truth of the matter is that things will come out over time. Sometimes they'll come out as a result of a court case, which takes a long time to evolve and develop. And other times it will take even longer than that. And we're looking, decades down the road, we're looking back at history and we're studying history to find out certain things maybe were classified and hidden from us. So my epistemology about the news is that the stuff I'm dealing with right now is the least accurate stuff. And we are most vulnerable to having to speculate to get to conclusions on things and make decisions. Now, I have operated most of my life in a heuristic type of model. My libertarianism, to me, the most important aspect of it is that it tells me when I don't have all the complete facts. It gives me a really good set of handlebars to say, this is probably what's happening right now. And I've continued to modify and tweak that over time, but it has been stunningly accurate in terms of helping me to get to where I need to go. So I'm stepping out with some trepidation here and wanting to put the caveat on that everything that I'm saying is based on really early evidence that tends to be the weakest evidence. And there tends to be conflict in the stories that only gets settled over time. And even new things emerge that we didn't know today about players, motives, and so forth. That will all continue to grow in the coming days and weeks. But right now, I'm able to operate somewhat heuristically and say, okay, based on what I know, I think I see some things here that we at least need to ask some questions about or keep our eyes open to.
Yes.
Even if all of the conclusions that we arrive at today are highly provisional.
And we've seen this over and over in world events. I hate to mention it, but the response to COVID was one such instance.
And we're another example of this for me. My favorite personal life example of this is at truthaboutwar.org, which is archived in time, where we basically said what was going to happen in Iraq when George W. Bush moved to attack them for no apparent reason. They made up a story about weapons of mass destruction. We said that story isn't true. Time has borne that out. The information was there if you were looking for it, and that was based on some heuristics. Here's an example of a heuristic. When wars occur, politicians are more prone to lie than ever. So you can say, okay, well, what are they lying about? Because they benefit from it. So we can do some of the same type of heuristic thinking there. These are educated guesses where we don't yet have all the facts. We may be wrong, but they're based on testing that we have done historically on similar events. We try to find patterns of behavior and look very closely at the incentives in a given situation. And the incentives are being openly discussed here in this case as well.
Yes, and we're offering sort of a third rail, a third point of view, another point of view.
Yes.
Today, I can see where you're going to go with this, and I'm thrilled about that because it's important to have these early, I'll just call it an openness to what may or may not be reflected by the facts, right? And our response to the facts as we see them in their very myopic minutia right now is going to change. But we need to have a response that allows for that change rather than knee jerks based on what we see that we think we believe we have a response to right now. Is that really weird, people? I mean,
yeah, and I think that's part of maybe one of the grace points that comes out of our discussion. I mean, we're always looking to try to find the grace in the situation. So, I mean, dialogue has to be conducted a certain way. Fact finding is what I'm now saying needs to be conducted a certain way as well.
Yes,
to arrive at a gracious response.
You don't make up.
It takes account empathy of all the parties involved.
Exactly right. Rather than going at it with I need to find this to support my thesis, we go at it with what's happening here and what is the thesis that will emerge organically from the facts.
Okay. So we've now laid everything on the table.
We are. And the facts are?
Okay. The facts are that on February 3rd, there was a train derailment. The NTSB suggests that this was because of a faulty axle. There's some evidence that it was on fire. I'm not conversant yet in all of the technology that was involved in this. I have a feeling many Americans who didn't know a lot of this stuff will start to learn it. And I'm learning about this as I go. But apparently there are sensors that sit on the railroad. And when the train rides over on the track and it hits these sensors at various junctures, and they're spread decently far apart, the train undergoes a variety of tests, so to speak, and it provides a feedback mechanism that tells if there is a gear that is grinding, because that could actually start a fire, if there is an axle that is broken, if there's just various functions. Like it's literally measuring how stuff is going over on the track. And without getting too technical, the way that it works for the railroad in this particular instance is they get a notification that's sent out in an audio transmission. The technology that I just described has been around since, like, I don't know, the 50s, 60s, some time frame like that. But in recent years, the way they do it is they get an automatic audio transmission that's delivered to them by a robot type voice that tells them they got a problem. And they got an alert and they hit the brakes, but they hit the brakes too late.
So
There was already
this
a
alert
fire.
goes, the stationary track, the train runs over the track, the sensor picks up something and then broadcasts it to the engineer.
Yes.
Who can hit
And
the
they
brake.
put on the emergency brakes, but they did it a bit too late.
Yeah.
They ended up with a portion of the cars following them derailing. How much? So specifically, there were chemicals that were being transported, multiple chemicals. We don't, at this juncture, I mean, this is one of the things that's really fascinating to me, is that we don't have a confirmed list of all of the chemicals that were being transported in this particular set of cars, right? We don't know. We do know that of one, and that is the one that's at the center of attention right now, but there may be others, and this problem could potentially be worse than what we're about to describe. So the chemical we do know about in this case, the one that's making all the news, is vinyl chloride. And vinyl chloride, this is going to stun everybody. I was stunned anyway when I heard it. Starts boiling at 8 degrees Fahrenheit. You heard me right. It starts boiling at 8 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's obviously
basically vaporizing. It's got to be stored cold.
It's got to be stored really cold. There you go. So as soon as it falls off the track and it starts to leak, it doesn't matter what you do next. All options are bad. Okay. We'll get into a bit more of that in just a second. Well, no, let's go ahead and get into it now. So the options are all bad. A decision was made. I'm unclear who was involved in making this decision to basically firebomb it. They decided to blow it up. And this is causing a great deal of consternation and debate in right now, particularly for the people who are underneath the clouds that have emerged as a result of this. And when I say underneath the clouds, I'm not speaking metaphorically. Like, it got dark, okay? It got black, and they had to evacuate the area. I'm talking about the fact that if they would have left it on the ground, there was no way to clean it up, more than likely. That's what's appearing to be the case right now because of the hazardous nature of the chemical. Yeah. So if they couldn't safely clean it up, what was plan B? Plan B was to blow it up. And the idea is that it would dissipate up into the atmosphere. It would get dispersed out. And as it becomes smaller and smaller, the threat is lower and lower. Okay. The problem is that when they blow it up, it turns into hydrogen chloride. So hydrogen chloride gets in the water, it gets into the water vapor, which is in the air, and there's moisture moving all through the air. So the moisture is moving through the air and it's carrying hydrogen chloride, and it converts there to hydrochloric acid, which is something that we're all a little more familiar with.
Sure, acid rain.
And now everybody's breathing that stuff in pretty high concentrations, and it's attracted to water, so it gets into water streams. So you have dead fish turning up in the river there by the hundreds, if not the thousands. You have stories of animals, livestock. This is a farming region. There's a lot of farming that goes on in this area. Having picked it up, is it in the food? Did we just give livestock, for example, cancer? Their animals are not responding well. We're aware of 2 stories that seem to have broken out and kind of made the bigger news. The first involves a man with foxes. He keeps foxes. And his foxes have elevated liver enzymes and accelerated heartbeats and lethargy, and they're not doing well. He's actually very concerned when I saw him on the news night before last. I don't know what the resolution of that story is, if there's been further progress as I'm telling you about this right now. The second story that's making it out, and this is the one that's tugging at people's hearts the most, is of a woman with a cat whose cat became basically catatonic, stopped eating, stopped drinking. Very accelerated heart rate, eyes watering and dilated, elevated liver enzymes once again. And she took the cat to the vet. They said, this is directly because of what just happened. You're too close to the epicenter of it. And this is the cat's, it's going to take a lot to save the cat. She said, how much? They said $15,000. So the story that we are being told right now, and I'm going to say this is allegation because I've not been able to confirm all of this. I don't know the woman's name, for example, is that she went to the railroad and said, I need $15,000 to pay the vet to save my cat. And they said, we're not doing payouts right now. If you, we may be doing them later, which is going to do a fat amount of good for the cat. She ended up terminating the cat at the $9,000 billing mark. And this is not an area of the country, if you visit it, that is known for its wealth. I mean, this is, it's on the opposite end of that spectrum, so to speak. It's very, working class and poor. You want to talk about the recent fentanyl and heroin epidemic that's gone on in this country. This is, an epicenter of it practically. Things have been rough. As I said earlier, nobody's from here. Nobody goes there. If somebody, somebody, they're from there, right? That's how this works. Maybe you grew up there and then you leave. It's not an area that tends to attract people. And so they're kind of overlooked and forgotten, unfortunately, as people. And this is why part of the reason, in my humble opinion, it's taken so long for their story to get out, as bleak as it is, and what has happened to the water supply. I wish the story ended there, Bill. I wish it did. So just by way of comparison, we've had an accident like this happen before. It happened in New Jersey in the past. And they had 23,000 gallons of this dispersed. 23,000. So that was the previous record.
Same stuff.
There were 5 rail cars that had this chemical, just this vinyl chloride on it alone, that they set on fire. Each car, we're going to say, probably carries roughly 25,000 gallons in it. So we're looking at an accident that's 5 times the size of the previous record. And it's about 200,000 pounds per car now that it's started to dissipate of this stuff. That's how much we're talking about that started to burn and go up into the atmosphere. If you want to do the math, 5 times 200,000, you're looking at about 1 million pounds worth of vinyl chloride. You say, why do we need vinyl chloride? Vinyl chloride is used in PVC. Many of us have PVC plumbing in our house. That's the most common or familiar application for it. So this was being transported for purposes of being able to primarily for PVC creation, but it has to be handled very gently and carefully and very cold until it's actually deployed to its final use. That's not what happened here. What happened here is clouds that seem to have extended out even beyond the city. We have a picture from an airplane that an airplane passenger took, where they're driving along, and you've been in the airplane and you're on top, and you can look down and you see the white cloud, and there's a black mark in the cloud. And they didn't know what it was at the time. They get down and find out. They're like wanting to know what the black mark is. Oh, they were over East Palestine, Ohio. The neighboring communities, and the circle appears, from what I can understand right now, to be about 15 miles in each direction in terms of the air quality, where people have some sense of being able to see it in the clouds or smell it in the air. And oddly enough, the state has told everybody that it was okay to go home. Governor DeWine, who locked us all down, he was the very first governor in the country to issue lockdowns in COVID, and did it on the basis of seeing teens and 20-somethings at bars, saying, we're going to spread this pandemic everywhere, has participated in telling people it's okay to go home. And they have gone home, and they've turned around and left. And these are people, again, how many people can afford, even in the sound of my voice, to just pick up and leave your house and go stay at a hotel? Or you've got a friend's house you can go to, and you could just completely upend your life, and it's not going to cause you real economic dislocation in the process. How many of us also have a home that constitutes a significant portion of our wealth, right? And now all of a sudden you're in what they're calling Chernobyl on the Ohio, right? Did this whole neighborhood get Chernobyl by this? I think it's way too soon to be able to tell this, but if I were there, I would have a hard time containing my anger. And I want to empathize with those people. And I think the rest of the country should want to empathize with those people in the situation in which they find themselves right now.
I read something which is probably related, some major news outlet doing a story about all the hazmat stuff that gets transported by rail and how safe it is. And also to raise awareness of how much of that stuff comes really close to a lot of population centers. And this is not to compare in any
Yes.
way, but this stuff is flowing through major cities regularly. So I can
let me say
see where
one
the
quick thing
response
about
is
that.
here.
There's an element of how you measure risk and how you deal with risk that it goes into this whole equation, and it's going to play a role in the solutions and the future we begin to talk about here. There are some, if you have to jump a puddle, like you're just going to jump a puddle, there's a risk you're going to get your shoes wet. You might not be able to jump the whole puddle, right? But that's the risk, and it's rather the consequences of the risk are rather small. So even if you fail, you're not too worried about those. Then there are risks that are catastrophic in nature. Now, even if there was a 99% chance that you were going to be able to leap the chasm, you might choose still not to make the leap, even if the odds are really high that you're going to succeed, because if you miss, you drop down the chasm and you die. And so what we're jumping at a given moment is one of the things that you have to measure in risk is what the consequences are attached to it. Now, how many trains derail and how many of them cause a problem this big? The number is very, very small. However, when it happens, it's like jumping into the chasm.
Exactly.
And so there has to be some system in place for handling this matter. And I want to go, as we start to now veer into like, okay, how has this been handled politically? We have to say that there are some things that have happened here that I think first of all, I think there's a set of questions that need to be raised. And second, I think we have to be very specifically critical of the current administration on a very, very specific recent news matter.
Okay,
so you want me to go with that?
As far as the facts, yeah, we want to do that, but I just want to make sure I understand. So train derails, we've got vinyl chloride on board. It can't be cleaned up, so they make the decision to blow it up.
That appears to be the truth at this. There's some debate about this, but that appears to be what the science is saying right now.
Okay, yes. So is that the railroad decision or a public policy decision, or is that part of a response that's, like pre?
At this hour, we still don't know who made that call. That's still out there for us to figure out. That's one of the things that needs to emerge. Now, it's possible somebody watching this knows the answer to that question, but in the bits of research that I've been able to do, that's one of the outstanding items.
That's one of the questions. Okay, so with that as the sort of backdrop, on to our response, right? So this is a very important moment in this particular episode, right here at 30 minutes in. I want to challenge you, Jim, to say, what is the skillful response to this that you're not going to hear from the conflict machine?
That a government is part of the problem, not the solution. So let's break this down with the bad side of this first. Let's talk about what's happening politically at the moment. First, there is rumor floating around, and I understand that there's even a form on this, and this was literally just before I sat down here. I have not had time to dig into this at all. But the railroad, starting to sense a problem, has hit the streets and has begun offering citizens $5,000. That's the rumor that's floating around right now. I have not been able to confirm that. They're looking to, find a cheap way out to indemnify themselves quickly. $5,000 doesn't do much or help very much. Maybe it helped cover some.
That woman's cat,
Yeah. So, and it would be a mistake to sign that. So if you're presented with something to sign at the railroad at this juncture, this is confirmed, a lawsuit filed, and they've requested that the court turn it into a class action.
A class, yeah.
So wait for that. Don't sign anything now, because it will let the railroad off the hook lightly. And my solution is not going to involve letting the railroad off lightly. We'll get into that. But I want to go back in time. We're sitting here talking in February. This is the year 2023, December 2022. We were all very young then. It's a long time ago. The Biden administration, the Department of Transportation, led by former presidential candidate, maybe future Pete Buttigieg, dictated to the Railroad Workers Union that they could not strike. If they struck, it would be a crime. They would be arrested. They had to keep working. And the terms of the deal were dictated to them. At the time that they made this offer, or they made this edict, there were things on the table in the negotiation involving safety and the need for certain personnel in certain places to do things. I'm not going to get into specifics of that. I'm no expert on that particular case either, but safety concerns were on the table. Now, as a matter of principle, I'm a voluntarist. I start off there and I say that all my relationships should be freely chosen. And the people had chosen to voluntarily bind together to engage in what is called collective bargaining with the railroad. And since they had already made that voluntary choice to organize, their voluntary decision should have been honored. Moreover, any job that you have where you are required to show up under penalty of law, right? Not under penalty of not getting a paycheck. That's the choice. There's an exchange there. Any job that you have to show up under penalty of law, we have a name for that. Okay. This might be a little bit hard to swallow because we've had a bad history with this particular word, but the word is enslavement. It's slavery. And nobody from the railroad should have been compelled to show up to work if they believed in their heart and conscience that the terms of the deal were bad. They should have been able to choose any reason they wanted not to show up that day. Doesn't mean the railroad has an obligation to pay them or even retain their services going forward, but they should have been able to do that. And the reason they did a collective bargaining approach is because they wanted to be able to tell the union en masse, we're all going to leave work at the same time, and then where you're going to be. Okay. So that's how they gain their power to be able to come back and address these issues. Instead of addressing these issues, the Biden administration took the easy way out. And I am at pains right now to express that the Democratic Party has in the previous generation, in my father's generation, has portrayed itself to be the party of the working man. And in this area of Appalachia, they have seen a massive transition and turnover into being a party of being part of the Republican Party, to being part of the Trump movement. The gentleman that was just recently elected senator here from the state of Ohio is from that part of the country. These are basically his people, so to speak. And he ended up writing Hillbilly Elegy, which was turned into a movie. And so these people have been kind of overlooked. And so the generation that's there now is just as anti-Democrat as they were pro-Democrat, yellow dog Democrat in the previous generation, because they noticed that they've been ignored. This is unions we're talking about. And the Democratic Party told the unions they had to go back to work. Your concerns can't be heard.
Well, that backfired.
It appears to have. And this is one of the things that we have to understand is, were the things that they were asking for relevant? We don't know this yet. Were the things that they were asking for relevant to this situation?
To this particular derailment.
And if a strike had happened, might it have changed some things such that this particular train trip would not have occurred with this, or it wouldn't have occurred with the vehicle in the shape that it's in right now? We don't know any of that stuff yet. We have to have some really deep analysis of that question. But it is one of the questions we should be looking to answer in this whole thing. But I want to point out that as I'm going to talk about doing stuff in the absence of government, which people have a hard time imagining, I want to turn it around and point out, let's just make sure the defense or the net level is at the same level for both sides serving. That when people say to me, well, your voluntarist libertarian ideas will never work, like we need government. We have government right now, and this happened. We have government right now, and they may have actually played a role in how it happened. Okay. And the other thing that tends to happen in these situations, and this is really unfortunate, is that we tend to socialize the losses. So the company will be able to write a check that'll hurt, but they'll go on, and the rest of us get stuck picking up the tab, whether we had anything to do with it or not. There were other people, and I'm going to point out who they are in this situation, who should have borne the burden of this. And then the rest of us, it should have been up to us whether we wanted to participate and be of help because we care for our fellow man. And so the view I'm going to lay out here, you can accuse me of being unrealistic and say, well, we need the government, but look at where the government's got you.
I'm hurting right now because, and you may not know this, but I've been a student of the deaths of despair. Angus Deaton's book, he and his wife wrote this about why suicides in that region of the country have skyrocketed. Mm-hmm. And particularly for male union workers. And I have nothing but empathy right now for this, because these are people who are doing the heavy lifting. They've always done the heavy lifting, and they've been well supported and represented by unions, which as a libertarian, I'm kind of on the fence, but I can see the
Yep.
value of that, you know?
Yep.
And it's a voluntarious thing. And then to be, you know, dissed by your own party, no wonder that area has shifted from Democrat to Republican.
Yeah.
So this
just
will emerge, right? The facts
just to
will
dwell on
emerge.
this, and one more point, I appreciate you raising it. One of the people that I got to see here in getting prepared to come on is an on-the-ground reporter who was born there. He doesn't presently live there, but doesn't live far away. And he had 55. I guess he went directly to East Palestine to the high school there. He had 55 people in his graduating class. Darn near half of them are dead, and this is a guy who's appearing to me to be in his late 30s. The number one killer, the opioid epidemic. So this is a problem. This is a forgotten area, and the fact that it took the national media so long to catch up is really telling about how the establishment, how the Joe Bidens of the world, and by the way, politicians on both sides of Congress, look at this area. Nobody was raising alarms, and this was not a story until roughly Tuesday, Wednesday this week.
And thank you to the independent media boots on the ground for bringing it to a level where it became national, so that we could put some focus on this.
Right.
So what's the response here, Jim? I mean, there's very little that anybody can practically do about this, but there's plenty that we can say and conjecture and conflict about. But what's the opportunity right here?
Yeah, we have something we can learn from this. So I want to just paint a vision of a better world. At the Zero Aggression Project, which sponsors this show, zeroaggressionproject.org, we introduced an idea, Perry Willis and I. And that idea was summed up in a sentence that we are pro-government, but anti-state. And I just want to point out that everywhere you go, there is some kind of hierarchy or governance. There are people who are taking the lead on things and making sure that things get done. And that is going to exist regardless. So the idea typically, and I think even libertarians themselves contribute to this, we end up in a situation where we sound like we're anti-government, and we're not anti-government. We're very pro-governance. We want, if anything, more government. What we want removed is the coercion of government, because it attracts power seekers who will use it to engage in various types of power seeking and graft, financial benefit type activities. It invites corruption. It invites incompetence. It doesn't manage resources very well. And it takes from people to do things, takes money from people to do things that they would not have done with their own money. And it damages in the process their happiness, their harmony, and prosperity. So for all of those reasons, we look at this and say, we don't want that kind of system in place anymore. What we want instead is a system that has a whole lot more community to it and has a whole lot more accountability to it. And here I point to an idea, Perry Willis devised this, that you have more power as a consumer than you do as a citizen. As a citizen, you're just one tiny vote. You are a drop in an ocean. But as a consumer, you have tremendous power, and we've seen that power flexed. It can start from the most simplest of things. You said you wanted them to hold the onions on your burger. They put the onions on anyway. By the way, I like onions on my burger. It's just an example. And you got onions on your burger. So, now you're not going to go back to that restaurant anymore. Or maybe you're going to complain to the manager and expect some kind of response. And you will get it because you have that much leverage in that situation. But now when you got to dial up, the local bureaucracy and try to get them to move, how much power do you personally actually have? No, it turns out you got to go get your friends. Can you imagine if every time you wanted to get your order fixed at McDonald's, you had to call 10 of your friends?
300 friends to be exact.
Yeah, 300, yes. So, here's the thing I'm going to say here. You definitely, it's unequivocal. I've had some people be play dumb with me. I don't know how else to describe it. When I've suggested this before, it's just so clearly obvious. It's axiomatic that you have more power as a citizen than you do, sorry, as a consumer than you do as a citizen. So given that that's the case, what could we do to make life better? And how could we tackle and address problems like this? And for me, the solution starts with having the entire thing be voluntary and it not have the protection of the state. Now you can't hide under the skirt of the state and disperse the problem out and make the taxpayers pick up your bill. You have to figure out how to do that. And you need to fund these high risk situations adequately to be able to handle that. You also need to be able to embrace the accountability that's going to come naturally with that. So corporations themselves are creatures of the state, and they gain a certain protection in what the service that they provide, which I think would be made available in the free market as well, without state involvement, is to shield investors in a company from the consequences of the actions of that company. So my solution here would be kind of multifaceted, and that is that I would put a much more emphasis on common law, courts, and the ability of people to file torts in those places and demand restitution from the actor who committed the offense. If this system existed, then the level of insurance that would be necessary to pay for a catastrophic event would be adequate. Now, insurance companies aren't stupid. They hire very smart people, including actuaries, to figure out their actual risk and to make sure that they're going to come out ahead on the charge of the premiums they're going to put in place. And so they determine whether or not the journey is actually financially worth it. Is it worth going? Is it worth going to that place? If it's not, if you haven't actually can't bear the cost, then one of two things happens: either the good or service isn't going to move, or the price to move it is going to have to go up. But we find out what the actual natural cost of moving something like the product that makes PVC pipes really actually costs us. And it's actually computed into the price of the purchase of the product, so that the next time this thing happens, there is an insurance policy that covers the bill and it takes care of everything. And the company has less incentive to hide behind the political games and PR games that they're going to end up playing in this particular matter. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be willing participants. So they're going to jump right in and say, you know what, we want to do everything that's right here. You're going to have actors that want to cover their tracks and cover up what they're doing. And if we start off with the premise that rights and even the laws that we make are based somehow on empathy, then we understand that it's possible that a situation like this might occur where we tread new ground, like something extra catastrophic happens and it's the first time something like that happened. Now, typically there's some attempt to learn lessons and certain regulations have to be put in place, but
Sure.
Companies can get around those regulations because they tend to control, they have what's called regulatory capture over the regulatory boards, but they would never, ever con the insurance company into doing it because the insurance company is agreeing to share the risk with them. And if they did, the insurance company would go under too. So natural consequences would accrue in that situation as well. But there's one layer we still haven't gotten to, and that is the layer of the stockholders themselves. The idea that
Right.
you
Sure.
can invest in a company and you have no risk into the transaction. Insurance could be purchased for that too. Insurance could serve that function as well. And if it did serve that function, then you would take appropriate risk in the companies that you're buying, and you would actually follow the advice of maybe a good investment advisor, let you know they're following the best practices on risk and safety, and you would make better decisions. Now, I don't know that we should necessarily be penalizing in a common law sense people for owning a company that doesn't do well, but if your stock is worth a certain value and you're already susceptible to losing that, we should be willing to take that away if that's what's necessary to help pay the cleanup bills in this situation and to make the lives of the people who were using the product or who suffered as a result of the spill of this product in their community. I don't want to get into the weeds of how all this would work, except to say that maybe complete indemnification of the shareholders, if they can't be satisfied first through company assets and profits, and second through insurance. If it still can't be satisfied, there's still other funds there. How do I know there's other funds there? Because they're going to come and give all the rest of us the price tag. So the money's there. Somewhere along the line, the money's there. And in most cases, the company tends to survive these things. These really large companies get bailed out somehow by the politicians. And I'm saying that kind of thing shouldn't happen. So in a situation where you have this severe catastrophe, and it ends up going to court, and there's this judgment that's completely like record, and all of a sudden we tend to do two things. As I was starting to say, we tend to like make the railroad company, and all railroad companies will learn lessons from this, and they will say we need to have certain things in place, but they may be resistant to all the things the regulators will ask. They cannot resist all the things that the insurance company is going to demand, and they're going to want to let people know in that area that they have done the right things. Like the local area could have a concern in saying, did you follow the regulations correctly? Maybe we should cut down this part of the railroad and not allow it to transport if they're not going to meet the standards on this thing. And all of that could be made abundantly easier. It's the federal government that would prevent a local municipality or a county or even the state of Ohio in this particular case from being able to weigh in and say, you know what, we're seeing over here on this part of the rail line, on the part that comes through our neighborhood, that they're not doing the thing. Because guess what? These local governments don't have very much power with the bureaucracies either. Okay. The railroad has disproportionately more power with these with bureaucracies, and the local municipality doesn't feel like it needs to take responsibility for this. I don't know how many people are blaming the city council of East Palestine or Palestine right now. Okay. But how on top of all of this problem have they been, and what are they doing right now to advocate for their citizens? So, those are questions again about the failure of the state. And then there's one last layer I want to, and that is that we could choose to be compassionate and be involved too. So, I'm talking to my son about this morning, my son, Steve, and we both saw Damar Hamlin from the Buffalo Bills, and we did an episode about him, the Damar Hamlin moment here on Gracearchy that you can check out back when it happened. Well, Damar Hamlin was up and at the Super Bowl. He's walking around, and he's able to be interviewed even now. He's appeared on Good Morning America. And thank God. I mean, it's really good news that happened. But he had a small little charitable nonprofit that he had set up that hadn't raised much money, like a GoFundMe type of thing. And his GoFundMe took off and raised $7 million in the next few days after he was injured, right? Because the American people were motivated to help or do something, and they decided they wanted to support the cause that he'd embraced. So now he's got the most well-funded nonprofit. I mean, that's just it's a miracle. The people will respond to this, right? And this is where community becomes involved. Bill, one of the things that we've lost in the socialization of all of these things is we've lost our sense of community. And we all have relics of that sitting around in our neighborhood. I like to talk about this in the healthcare sense. There was Saint this and Saint that, and those were the names of the hospitals. We had the JCs and the Lions Club and different stuff that was on the ground in these areas, the Knights of Columbus, these different groups that were community where people were coming together, and that's how they had a sense of potluck and a sense of being able to, get meals to the families and funds and provide some help with the hospitalization expenses that a family would incur. And these were community functions that people were engaged in. They looked out for each other in times of needs. We've lost all of that because we now have the government do it for us. They take a cut off the top. They hand out some contracts to their friends. And then out of that, they deliver some modicum of service. But it almost certainly is way more expensive than if we had done it ourselves. And because we have so many middlemen involved in the process right now, and a little bit of graft and corruption to help lubricate the whole thing. And then we don't have instead that sense of kind of ad hoc community where we're just always looking out for one another. That stuff is gone. It's evaporated. And so my approach here is to first focus on who the actual liability belongs to. Make those mechanisms move much smoother because they're voluntarily run and everyone recognizes they're accountable to them. And then if that doesn't quite, scratch the itch, let's take advantage of the fact that people are good and willing to look out for their neighbor. They want to pitch in a situation like this and do everything they can to help.
I'm taking a real deep breath here to sort of consider everything, because the mechanisms that you've suggested are not in place. We have yet again an example of the inefficient way that the mechanisms that are in place deal with a tragedy.
Yes.
And we've
been
doing
right now what that is blame, by the way. Everybody's trying to figure out who to blame.
Who to blame,
Right.
right? Do we blame Mayor Pete for overriding the strike? Do we blame the strikers for getting in the way of progress? That's not the answer. Blame isn't going to work here. But we've done this many times. We mentioned some of them. This happens all the time, and it's not working.
It's not working.
It is just not working. So we're faced with a situation where we have this infrastructure that doesn't work, that's huge and immovable, and we have the potential for something that's better that we could in fact implement because human beings work that way. That's just how we do things. We're basically good people. Jim, the question is, how do we get from here to there, right? How do we bridge that gap so that we have a better response the next time a train load of vinyl chloride goes off the rails?
I think these institutions and structures need to be built, and I think the first step in getting them built is to have a conversation about about the need here. And I have chosen very specifically to have this conversation from the angle of grace. And I'm still not to the point where we're ready to do the episode I want to do on what a church actually is, what an ecclesia actually is. Because I think that we should all be a part of something. And it can take different shapes and forms, but for me, that's the form it would take, for me personally, and for potentially tens of millions of other people too. But I think every one of us should belong to some kind of community where we come into that community wanting to be of service, wanting to look out for one another. And then when we need it, it's there for us. And I want to point out, Bill, I just said that in the reverse order that maybe a lot of more economically minded people would have said that. I think it's important that we find communities where we could be of service. There is a burst of joy. There is happiness that comes along with knowing that you are of service to your fellow man.
Yes.
And the type of happiness we should seek is a desire, an innate desire to be of service, not to get something, to give something, because the giving is going to be what we get out of that is the feeling of good, the sense of being a good person and that you matter in the universe. You've made a difference in the lives of other people.
Yes.
If you do that and you do that well, there will be plenty of people standing there to help you when you need it. Those people will show up for you too. And other bystanders who haven't yet benefited from you will also be aware of your service and will be extra motivated to want to help you as well. So I'm all about suggesting that we have to find those pockets of service and we have to begin to build the government that we were never given.
So great encouragement to the people of East Palestine, Ohio right now.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to reach out, we hear you. I don't know what form that could take, but just, here we are a couple of guys doing a podcast. We hear you. Reach out. Let us know what will help. And for heaven's sakes, don't do it through the media. They'll get the story wrong. Yep. Stand up a GoFundMe, whatever it is that's grassroots, and let the world know. Please let the world know, because we're here and we want to do something. And Jim, you're absolutely right. Until I started volunteering for stuff, I had no idea what it was like to serve. And that notion of service and the way that it works on me is beautiful. It's just beautiful. Final words. Anything you'd like to throw out?
Thanks for listening.